One interesting way, especially in small sample sizes, but really in all types of experiments, that you can make sure that the two treatment groups are roughly equal is to use a method called matched pairs. A typical experiment has two separate groups being compared. We have Group A, Group B. And each of these two groups might be different in only one way, the type of treatment they're receiving, but otherwise they're essentially identical. However, when there's not a lot of subjects, there are lots of potential confounding factors. There are lots of lurking variables that could make these two groups different. If you had a small number of people and most of them were suffering from some form of depression in one group and another group not as many, that might change how they react to something. If you have certain people that are more physically fit in one group than another, that might change how they react to something. Things like that, that especially when you have small sample sizes, can really be an issue. However, one way to get around this is you find two very similar things and directly compare their results. Two very similar individuals, two very similar experimental units or subjects, and you would directly compare their results and do that all the way through. So, simplest example is twins, particularly identical twins, because genetically they are identical. So in some ways they are the same, yet they are different. They act different, they have different friends sometimes, they have different behaviors. So you can compare things more on the behavioral side and not worry about the genetic effects when you're comparing identical twins. Another one would be siblings. Now, siblings are not identical genetically, but they often grow up in the same place, the same environment, same parents, and so they're going to have a lot of behavioral things that are very similar to each other. Married couples. Now, in many ways, they can be very different, but at the same time, they might share certain beliefs or certain habits with each other that would make them a good pair to study in an experiment. Another one would be roommates, anything that could naturally fit together. By the way, for those of you who recognize the movie, this would be The Parent Trap. Anyways, another way to do matched pairs is not to use two different subjects, but to actually have the same subject used. So you could compare one person and compare their left and right hand. What can they do with their left hand? What can they do with their right hand? You could compare the same person before they do something and after. You could have a test before and after. And building on that same idea, you could test two different treatments at different times. You could test one treatment on week 1, take a week off, and test a totally different treatment on week 3. You might randomly decide what order these treatments go in. But what you would do is you would measure the results of this experiment, you'd measure the results of this experiment, and you would directly compare them for every single person. Every single subject in the study would directly have a difference between their two results. In the case of the two different siblings or twins or whatever, you would have one twin do one treatment group, another twin do a different treatment group, and you would directly compare their results, and you would look at this big list of differences between the two groups. Which brings us to our next idea, that when you're analyzing matched pairs experiments, you have to do the analysis a little bit different. Now, we're not going to get too much into the details of this right now, because in a later section we're going to break this apart and look at the numbers. But instead of looking at the entire treatment groups, group 1 versus group 2, we look at every pair. So we have A1, A2, let's say that's a pair. We would directly compare those two to get the difference between the A's, A1 minus A2. And we would continue that on for B1 minus B2, B3, or C1 minus C2, so forth. The idea that you're directly comparing two people, getting a difference, and you're analyzing the differences. So when you have two separate groups, you don't even need the same sample size in each group. You're just comparing the average of this group to the average of that group. Matched pairs is going to be a little bit different, so just have your heads up for that.